We shall commence this module by understanding the classification of public expenditure. Public expenditure is classified on several bases. In India, in official public finance statistics, these expenditures are classified in three main ways. Firstly, revenue and capital, secondly, development and non-development, and thirdly, planned and non-planned. We shall discuss in this lesson only the revenue and capital expenditure. Revenue expenditure is actually current account expenditure and is called revenue expenditure in India for historical reasons. They are supposed to meet all expenditures of current nature, whether development or non-development, whether planned or non-planned. They meet salaries, they are spent on supplies, they also meet the payment of interest on debts incurred for any purpose, and they also include expenditure incurred on subsidies in provision and grants to other governments and other bodies. They do not create assets, nor do they pertain to loans and advances. In contrast, capital expenditure is expenditure incurred to create assets, physical or financial. Expenditure incurred on construction of buildings, laying of railway lines, of making roads, building dams or hydroelectric power stations, etc., or acquiring physical property is all capital expenditure. Giving loans and advances create financial assets for the government on which they may earn interest, and interest receipts in turn will be put under revenue head and will be considered as revenue receipts. All revenue expenditures are further classified in four categories. Firstly, interest payments on loans raised, secondly, defense expenditure, thirdly, subsidies, and fourthly, pay and allowances. These are all different in nature. While interest payment is related with past loans, subsidies relate with current welfare activities. Defense expenditure is often distinguished from other expenditures which are of civil nature. Pay and allowances are expenditures incurred on personnel carrying out civil activities and responsibilities of the government. Capital expenditure, as suggested above, also are of two kinds. Building or acquiring physical capital is one of them. The other is acquiring financial assets, which in short means giving loans and advances to other governments, national or foreign. Financial assets are supposed to yield interest as receipts to the government in question. After studying this module, you shall be able to analyze the trends in revenue and capital expenditures, comprehend the trends in various components of revenue expenditures, and comprehend the trends in various components of capital expenditures. Let us now discuss the trends in revenue and capital expenditure. The first major trend in public expenditure which we observe in India is the growing revenue expenditure of the government from rupees 14,410 crores in 1980-81 to rupees 10,40,723 crores in 2010-11. Though in terms of absolute number, the total expenditure has risen to 80-fold, but it is clear that in terms of ratio with GDP, it is almost stagnant. On the other hand, composition has changed in favor of revenue expenditure. Increased defense commitments, expansion of the administration, working of democratic institutions like the parliament, the government's international commitments, increase in government's participation in nation building activities like education and public health, rise in prices, etc. All these are responsible for increased revenue expenditure of the central government. Capital expenditures during the same period increased about 20 times from 8,358 crores in 1980-81 to rupees 1,56,605 crores in 2010-11. In the 1980s, the major thrust of the government was improved infrastructure and rural development. Therefore, the capital expenditure were high during this period. Revenue expenditures were, however, mounting and as a percentage of GDP increased from 9.6% in 1980-81 to 12.5% in 1990-91. With the increasing public debt, the interest payment grew from 1.7% of the GDP in 1980-81 to 3.6% in 1990-91. Defense expenditure during this period stayed above 2% of GDP throughout. Subsidies increased from 1.3% in 1980-81 to 2% in 1990-91. Out of the capital expenditure, loans and advances and capital outlay declined, resulting in a fall in capital expenditure to GDP ratio from 5.5% to 5.4% during this period. In 1980-81, revenue expenditure averaged about 63% of total expenditure and increased to about 70% in 1990-91, with the bulk of expansion coming from under the heads of defense, interest payment and subsidies. The capital expenditure share in total expenditure declined from 36.7% to about 30% during the same period. The share of total expenditure in GDP started falling in the 90s after the reforms, mainly because of the macroeconomic stabilization program that followed the 1991 balance of payment crisis. It fell from 17.96% in 1990-91 to 15% in 2000-2001. As a percentage of GDP, capital expenditure fell from 5.4% in 1990-91 to 2.2% in 2000-2001. Revenue expenditures, on the other hand, showed an increase from 12.5% in 1991 to 12.8% in 2000-2001, mainly because of the increase in interest expenditures. Defense expenditures and subsidies both showed a decline during the decade. The fall in capital expenditure could be attributed to fall in loans and advances from 3.3% in 1990-91 to about 1% in 2000-2001 and fall in capital outlay from 2% to 1% during the same period. The composition of total expenditures was skewed in favor of revenue expenditure, and the ratio of revenue expenditures in total expenditure increased from about 70% in 1990-91 to about 85% in 2000-2001. Capital expenditures as a percentage of total expenditures reduced from 30% to about 14.6%. In 2000s, there was no change in the composition of total expenditures, with revenue expenditure increasing slightly from 85% in 2000-2001 to 87% in 2010-11. Capital expenditure share in total expenditure reduced from 14.6% in 2000-2001 to 13% in 2010-11. Total expenditure as a percentage of GDP increased to 15.6% in 2010-11 from 15% in 2000-2001. Revenue expenditures increased to 13.5% in 2010-11 from 12.8% in 2000-2001, and capital expenditures on the other hand declined from 2.2% in 2001 to 2% in 2010-11. Out of the revenue expenditures, defense expenditures and interest payments as a percentage of GDP have shown a decline, whereas subsidies have increased from 1.2% in 2000-2001 to 2.2% in 2010-11. Out of the capital expenditures, loans and advances have shown a decline, whereas capital outlay have shown an increase from about 1% in 2000-2001 to 1.7% in 2010-11. Overall, capital expenditure as a percentage of GDP declined from 5.5% in 1980-81 to 5.4% in 1990-91 and further to 2.2% in 2000-2001. It went down to 2.04% in 2010-11. By contrast, revenue expenditures, which were 9.6% of GDP during 1980-81, rose to 12.5% in 1991 and further to 12.8% in 2000-2001. In 2010-11, it went up to 13.5%. Let us now move on to discuss the trends in the components of revenue expenditures. A major chunk of revenue expenditures is comprised of interest payments, defense expenditures, subsidies and government salaries, and there is a very bleak chance of these three items being kept under control. First is interest payments. The fiscal deficit of the Government of India have increased since the 80s. This has led to the increased deficit financing through the borrowings to meet these deficits, and that has led to the ever growing public debt. The interest burden of the central government has thus increased over the years. The interest payment is a committed liability, and the outgo on this account is determined by the past stock of public debt and its composition, current level of fiscal deficit and interest prevailing in the present as well as interest rates of the past. As a percentage of GDP, the interest burden had increased from 1.7% in 1980-81 to 3.6% in 1990-91. In the 90s, the higher interest rates had resulted in a significant part of revenue receipts being used for interest payments. The fiscal consolidation process undertaken during the reforms of the 90s did bring in some control in the debt burden of the government in the first half of 90s. Still, the interest burden was high and continued to increase because the government borrowings were at a market determined rate of interest which was high. The interest burden went up from 3.6% in 1990-91 to 4.5% in 2000-2001. With the softening of interest rates, the declining trend was witnessed in the 2000s. Reflecting this as a percentage of GDP, interest payment came down from 4.5% in 2000-2001 to 3% in 2010-11. Next, let us talk about defense expenditure. The central government also undertakes revenue and capital expenditure for defense purposes. Defense expenditure in absolute terms is increasing because of growing tensions in the region and the use of highly expensive technology in war equipments. Defense expenditure has shown a steady decrease from 2% of GDP in 1980-81 to 1.8% in 1990-91. Then it went down to 1.7% in 2000-2001 and further down to 1.2% in 2010-11. Now let us discuss about the subsidies. Expenditure on subsidies is a crucial element of government expenditures, particularly in the light of targeting poverty alleviation and the growing need to rationalize expenses for fiscal consolidation. In addition to the explicit subsidies, several implicit subsidies in the form of lower user charges for economic and social services provided by the government are also incurred and thus should be taken into account in the total burden of the subsidies. Subsidies on food, fertilizer and on export promotion have become an integral part of central government expenditure, and despite government's frequent promise to reduce them, they are continuing to rise year after year. During the 80s, as a percentage of GDP, subsidies increased from 1.3% in 1980-81 to 2% in 1990-91. In the 90s, initiatives were taken to curtail the expenditure on subsidies. The export subsidies were phased out and fertilizer prices were decontrolled. Accordingly, total explicit subsidies of the central government were reduced from 2% of GDP in 1990-91 to 1.2% in 2000-2001. In the decade 2000 to 2010, the subsidy burden went up again. The reason of this rise was the introduction of petroleum subsidies with the dismantling of administered price mechanism, and also due to the global financial crisis suffered in 2008-9. The subsidies as a percentage of GDP went up from 1.2% in 2000-2001 to 2.2% in 2010-11. Let us now discuss pay and allowances. In the rising bill in respect to wages, salaries and pensions is considered an important element in the fiscal health of the government, particularly in the recent years. These components partly represent the committed expenditure obligations of the government. An intertemporal analysis of the behavior of the expenditure on these components shows periodic spurts corresponding to the implementation of the Pay Commission recommendations. The data pertaining to pay and allowances of central government, which reveals that expenditure on pay and allowances increased from 2,751 crores to 97,566 crores in 2010-11, showing an increase by 36 times. The total cost to government on account of pay and allowances during the last 30 years, however, had a considerable decline as a percentage of GDP due to a cut in government staff size during the period under reference. The pay and allowances expenditures as a percentage of GDP was 1.8% in 1980-81 and it went down to 1.7% in 1990-91. In 2000-2001, the ratio was 1.3% and it went down to 1.2% in 2010-11. Let us now discuss the trends in components of capital expenditures. Capital expenditures comprise of expenditures met usually from borrowed funds to increase the concrete assets of a material and permanent character. It comprises the capital outlays and loans and advances to state and other bodies. The central government's capital expenditure as a proportion of GDP has declined from 5.5% in 1980-81 to 5.4% in 1990-91 and then to 2.2% in 2000-2001. In 2010-11, it was recorded at 2.04%. Capital outlays, if we discuss them, capital outlays represent the expenditures incurred by the government to build its investments. These investments enhance the productive capacity of the country through provision of the infrastructure and capital goods. The impact of resource crunch and the need for fiscal correction has more often been in the form of compression of capital outlays. In 1980-81, the ratio of capital outlay was 2.05% of GDP. It increased to 2.07% in 1990-91. Amidst the financial consolidation process in the early 90s, the capital outlays of the centre declined to 1% in 2000-2001. There was some reversal of trend in 2000s and the centre's capital outlay went up to 1.7% in 2010-11. Further, let us talk about loans and advances. The growth rate of loans and advances as against GDP in 1980-81 was 3.5%, reducing slowly initially and coming down to 3.3% in 1990-91. In the next decade, it came down drastically to slightly more than 1% in 2000-2001. In 2010-11, the ratio was 0.33%. The reason of the fall being the debt consolidation and debt waiver schemes by the state governments started by the central government in 2005, which comprised consolidation, rescheduling and lowering of interest rates and waiver in certain cases. Now, in the end, we will summarize what we have learnt in this module. The first major trend in public expenditure which we observe in India is the growing revenue expenditure of the government from rupees 14,410 crores in 1980-81 to rupees 10,40,723 crores in 2010-11, which is 80-fold increase. Capital expenditure during the same period increased about 20 times from rupees 8,358 crores in 1980-81 to rupees 1,56,605 crores in 2010-11. The composition of total expenditures was skewed in favor of revenue expenditures and the ratio of revenue expenditure in total expenditure increased from 63% in 1980-81 to about 70% in 1990-91 and further to 85% in 2000-2001. Then it increased to 87% in 2010-11. Capital expenditures as a percentage of total expenditure reduced accordingly from 36.7% to 30% and further to 14.6% to 13%. Revenue expenditures as a percentage of GDP increased from 9.6% in 1980-81 to 12.5% in 1990-91. With the increasing public debt, the interest payments grew from 1.7% of the GDP in 1980-81 to 3.6% in 1990-91. Defense expenditures during the period stayed above 2% of GDP throughout. Subsidies increased from 1.3% in 1980-81 to about 2% in 1990-91. Out of the capital expenditures, loans and advances and capital outlay declined, resulting in a fall in capital expenditures to GDP ratio from 5.5 to 5.4% during this period. In the 90s, as a percentage of GDP, capital expenditures fell from 5.4% in 1991 to 2.2% in 2000-2001. Revenue expenditures, on the other hand, showed an increase from 12.5% in 1990-91 to 12.8% in 2000-2001, mainly because of the increase in interest expenditures. Defense expenditures and subsidies both showed a decline during this decade. The fall in capital expenditures could be attributed to fall in loans and advances from 3.3% in 1990-91 to about 1% in 2000-2001 and fall in capital outlay from 2% to 1.1% during the same period. Revenue expenditures increased to 13.5% in 2010-11 from 12.8% in 2000-2001, and capital expenditures on the other hand declined from 2.2% in 2000-2001 to 2% in 2010-11. Out of the revenue expenditures, defense expenditures and interest payments as a percentage of GDP have shown a decline, whereas subsidies have increased from 1.2% in 2000-2001 to 2.2% in 2010-11. Out of the capital expenditures, loans and advances have shown a decline, whereas capital outlays have shown an increase from 1.1% in 2000-2001 to 1.7% in 2010-11.